For joining me today. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the NSEE webinar on the Experience-Based Learning Taxonomy. My name is Paul Gaszak. I'm the Associate Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Robert Morris University, Illinois in Chicago. RMU is one of NSEE's strategic partner institutions. So I really appreciate your time today. And the structure of this presentation, I'm going to talk for somewhere in the ballpark of 20 or 30 minutes. At the end of it, I will open up for questions that you can send in via the text chat option. So if you have any questions, hold on to those at the end, and I'd be happy to answer whatever questions you may have. So a little bit about me as we get started here. My involvement with NSEE, I am one of NSEE's board members. I'm also an EEA faculty member, the group that teaches the Experiential Education Academy around the country, including at the National Conference each year. I was also the 2019 Conference Planning Committee Chair for NSEE's conference. So if you joined us at the Don Cesar this past September, that was me you saw running around throughout that process. And I'll also be the co-chair of the 2020 conference in Salt Lake City. The screen there shows also my track of time at Robert Morris University and the different roles I've had, including a very experiential start to my time at RMU as a teaching intern back in December of 2006. I was on the faculty side of the house, primarily in the English department, moved my way through faculty up to a dean role a couple of years ago, and then moved into my associate provost role earlier this year. So just about a year now creeping up on for my time as the CAO at Robert Morris University. And in terms of Robert Morris, you may have heard us in the news recently because we are in the process of integrating with our neighbor directly across the street from us in Chicago, Roosevelt University. So pending approval from our regional accreditor, our two universities will become one sometime this spring, which we're very excited about for a host of reasons, including the expanded opportunities we'll have for students, but also what we'll be able to do additionally in the field of experiential education with our partnership with NSEE, which will continue to hopefully grow as our two universities come together. And a little bit of background on RMU, which also sort of applies to Roosevelt, which is applicable to our conversation today around this taxonomy, is that Robert Morris's student demographic, we have a lot of first-generation students, a very diverse community of students. The last 9 years running U.S. News and World Report rated us as the most diverse university in the Midwest. We have a lot of low-income Pell-eligible students as well, and so that's a critical piece that's going to come into play in this conversation today around this taxonomy that we created. So as we get started, before we jump into the actual taxonomy and what that means, I want to start off this whole webinar with a little bit of an activity. And what we're going to do is I'm going to provide you with 5 different cases over the next 5 slides. And for each one of those, I want you to determine if you believe that case is an example of experiential education. And I want you to go with your quick gut reaction. So don't overthink it, and I'm not going to give you enough time to overthink it. Just gut reaction, what do you think? Is it or is it not an example of experiential education? And this is just sort of rhetorically answering to yourself on your end of the webinar, so you don't need to raise your hand or answer. But just think this through and answer for yourself, is this or is this not experiential? So example number 1 is an accounting firm. A senior accounting major takes an internship at a local accounting firm during tax season and gets to work directly with the CPAs at the firm. Take a second or two to think over, is that or is that not experiential? The second case, a guest speaker. A marketing manager from a local company comes to an introduction to marketing course to speak about her experience in the job and what it is like working in her industry. Take a second or two to think, is that or is that not experiential? Case number 3, a faculty member teaching a 300-level humanities course brings her students to a soup kitchen just before the holiday season to volunteer as a group and give back to the community as part of a unit on citizenship. Is that or is that not experiential? Case number 4. A business writing course has teams of students work through a simulation in which they are writers for a fictitious company. The teams are provided cases that define specific details, and they must produce a professional piece of writing in the correct format in a limited amount of time during the class period, as if the company would be using the material immediately. Is that experiential? In our last case, a culinary student studies abroad in France to learn about French cuisine, taking multiple courses that allow the student into the kitchen each day to work with local chefs. Is that experiential? Great. Well, hopefully you had a quick gut reaction answer to each one of those cases. And this is sort of laying the foundation for something that we're going to talk about more in just a little bit. So keep those answers in the back of your mind as we move forward. Now, as we start moving into this idea of an experiential taxonomy, what was the inspiration for this taxonomy before we talk about what specifically it is? So in about 2014, 2015, Robert Morris University started to design their own institutional model for experiential education that we've been using ever since. The model is really built off of Kolb's cycle as well as NSEE's 8 principles of best practice. It's our DARA model, sort of a simplified version of those things. And what it means, DARA, is design, act, reflect, and acknowledge. Design means that the experiential opportunities that are being provided for students have a direct connection to the learning outcomes for the course, and that the design of the experience is going to fulfill the full DARA model. The act means that students are going to learn through immersion and an experience that relates to a real life situation. And so that phrasing is sort of key and critical to where we're going to be going in a minute here. That it has to relate to a real life situation. Doesn't necessarily have to be a real life situation. Reflect, as we all know, reflection is a critical piece of experiential education. And lastly, acknowledge that students are provided with the opportunity to connect how the transferable skills gained or honed in the experience will apply to their future academic, personal, or professional endeavors. And so that question from students of when will I ever use this again, we want to make sure that as part of this model, students will have a clear answer to that. Whether it's a simple experience or a very large one, they'll know when they'll be using these skills once again, connecting those dots for them and not just hoping that they'll make the connection on their own. And this institutional model gets infused into all the many things that we do here at RMU. So across all 4 years of undergraduate study, we're trying to incorporate experiential opportunities in addition to the other kind of staple experiences that they would have, service learning internships and others. So this model really informs all the different opportunities we provide for students. And that kind of segues into our goals and what we've already done. So at RMU, we were already prior to this creation of a taxonomy and our certification processes I'm going to touch on in a minute, all of our students were already taking internships. That was just a mandatory requirement for all of our students. A majority of them were completing 1 or more iCenter projects, which is applied projects or project-based learning with external clients. Many institutions do stuff like that. It's really exciting. Here in Chicago, our students will typically pair up in teams to work with nonprofit companies or startups or nonprofit organizations that need some additional help, whether it's accounting work, building a website, so on. A majority of our students are also exposed to 1 or more service learning projects through the required courses that we have, particularly at the freshman and sophomore levels. And most of our degree programs are applied and career focused in nature. So something like our nursing program, there's no way to not be experiential at some point in that program as they have to do their nursing clinical rotations. So there's a lot of just natural experiential opportunities that come out of these degree programs. So that's what we were already doing. And so as we started to expand our efforts several years ago, what were our goals and how did that start to lead to this taxonomy idea? The RMU goals were to infuse experiential education into all of our undergraduate courses. We wanted something experiential in literally every undergraduate course. That was our goal, a lofty one, and that was what we were trying to push toward. We also had to do this on little to no budget. We're a small, private, not-for-profit university. We don't have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to throw at projects. And so we had to be very creative about how were we approaching this and how can we start to expand the opportunities for students without needing to throw money at the project. And in hindsight, that was actually what at first seemed like a barrier was actually very helpful for us, because by knowing that we had to be creative and find ways around the situation, it allowed us to really find some good solutions and not just throw money at the project and hope that something good would come of it. And lastly, one of our goals was to make sure that we could provide access to experiences for our diverse student body. So as I had mentioned, our student demographic, there are certain experiences that are very prohibitive for our students, particularly something like study abroad. Not only the financial aspect of it, but I've had students in my own classes over the years who may have come from the south side of Chicago and have never traveled outside of their neighborhood and have never been to the north side of the city. As crazy as it may seem at times, that our students have a very localized sense of the world around them. And so asking them to do something like study abroad, where they're not only traveling outside of their neighborhood, but outside of their country, can seem like a very daunting task. And so how can we scale up these experiences while providing access to all of our students? And as this started to happen, we started to build out this activity and course certification process where our faculty would submit experiences from their classes that they were delivering and working on that fit our DARA model. It would be reviewed by our Experience-Based Learning Institute based on a rubric that we had developed, which would then, these activities, as they were certified, would get added to a digital archive that's available to all of our faculty for them to use and to replicate in their own courses. And that's a part of the rubric standard, is that the activity and the experience has to be able to be replicated by other faculty. If it can't, it's not going to be added to the archive. And the faculty then, each quarter, we send out a form to faculty to plug in what certified activities are they delivering within their courses, as well as during the course evaluations, we have specific questions on experiential education, whether or not students are receiving them, whether or not they're speaking to the learning outcomes, and so layers of ways of figuring out whether or not the experiences are actually being embedded into our courses. And so that's sort of just a brief overview of our activity and course certification process. I don't want to dig too deeply into that. That's not what the webinar today is about, but this all kind of informs where we had to start going next in terms of our evolution of our experiential initiatives and how it informs this idea of a taxonomy. And when we were thinking about expanding our opportunities, one of the things that we noticed sort of as an eyeball test, so to speak, was that the more opportunities we were delivering to our students, the more benefit they were receiving. And we didn't have necessarily in the early going, though, any study or documentation or evidence to really fully show that that was working. We're gathering that now, particularly through our course evaluations and other methods. But there's also this study that was presented a couple of years ago at the NSEE conference about the impacts of experiential learning depth and breadth on student learning outcomes. It's a really great study. The APA citation is there at the bottom if you're interested in looking it up yourself, but their definition within the context of the study is not quite apples to apples to how we view experiential education at RMU, which we'll get into in a second here, but nonetheless does a really good job of proving that more is better, really, when it comes to experiential education, and not just more opportunities, but a variety of depth of opportunities also is very relevant to helping students achieve learning outcomes. So as we wrote back around now to the activity we did at the beginning, is this experiential? Those 5 different cases that I provided for you, if I had to take a guess, I would guess that most, if not all of us right now in the webinar would agree that the accounting firm, the internship, and the study abroad example, that those are absolutely experiential. Internship, study abroad, kind of staple experiential opportunities that most, if not all, universities and colleges offer in some capacity or another. I think we would all agree those are experiential. Those 3 in the middle might have some debate to go around, right? We'll start with that one in the middle, the soup kitchen. That one seems like it could be a very relevant service learning experiential opportunity, particularly if the experience was tied to the learning outcomes. And so the case study said it was a humanities class that was going to do this as part of a citizenship project. So there seems to be that design in place that suggests there is some kind of tangible benefit to both parties, both the students and to the site, for this experience. So that seems to be pretty experiential. However, if we were to strip that class component out, and let's say it was a 200 level math class, and the teacher decided they wanted to do it simply to do something nice for the community, it would be a nice experience. It would certainly help the community. It would be beneficial for the soup kitchen, but would it be speaking to student learning outcomes? Probably not. And so that wouldn't necessarily fulfill the model. We would probably see even more debate between cases 2 and 4 there. The guest speaker one in particular, thinking about it's very passive, right? The students aren't necessarily doing anything other than sitting in their desks and listening to the guest speaker, maybe asking some questions at the end. Is that going to be experiential? We probably have a good amount of debate there. The writing simulation as well. There's a lot of stuff the students are doing, but they're not actually engaging with any kind of external client. This is all a simulation, and it's all being done within the 4 walls of the classroom. So is that experiential? We probably have a lot of debate there. And inside of RMU, as we started fleshing out this DARA model, as we started fleshing out our certification process and our course certification process, these were the sort of debates that we were having. What are the different levels of experiences? What counts as experiential? What doesn't count as experiential? And we could all agree on certain very big picture things like study abroad or internships is absolutely being experiential. But then when we got into stuff like in our culinary program, when they're in the culinary labs and they're doing their knife skills, does that count as experiential? Because it's inside the 4 walls of the university. They're not doing it in the context of an actual kitchen environment. The same thing with general labs, be they nursing labs, science labs, right? If they're doing something in a lab, does that count as experiential if it's not actually in a workplace or out at a site? And so we were having all of these debates internally, and that's what started to inform our experiential taxonomy. And what we ultimately decided was that all of these things could be experiential if they follow the model. So, for example, with the guest speaker, if the guest speaker came in and was doing something that was connected to the course learning outcomes, the students had an opportunity to engage in some way with the speaker. If there was an effort on behalf of the teacher, on behalf of the faculty member, to engage in reflection with the students past the guest speaker, and if there was an opportunity for the facilitator, the faculty member, to tie in what happened with the guest speaker to transferable skills the students might get out of this experience, then even though it's a very small, sort of passive, sort of limited experience, we would still consider that experiential in the context of our DARA model. Now, where we start going from there is that we understand that something like a guest speaker inside of a class may not be as transformative of an experience as, say, studying abroad in France in learning French cuisine, or even going into an accounting firm. We understood that there were these different levels, these different layers of experiences, but nonetheless, all of them could be experiential were they fulfilling the model. And so that's what led us to this creation of an experience-based learning taxonomy. It first kind of came up from the idea of Bloom's taxonomy, and from one of our former faculty members who's now retired, who was sort of our Bloom's go-to person, and started kind of piecing together some of these ideas as we were talking about experiential education. And he thought, just as we have Bloom's taxonomy, why don't we have an experiential taxonomy that doesn't segregate experiences into the yes it is or yes it isn't or no it isn't categories, but rather puts them on a spectrum, sort of like Bloom's taxonomy does. Because as we look at Bloom's taxonomy, while there are different layers and different levels of learning that go on in the taxonomy, we know that learning is still going on at all the levels, right? Remember is not as complicated, not as intricate, not as complex or advanced as create, but nonetheless, learning is occurring at all of these levels. And so we started to frame our experiential efforts in that same way. Guest speaker may not be as complicated, as advanced, as intricate as study abroad, but nonetheless, experience and learning is occurring at all these different levels. And so that led us to this EBL taxonomy that we started to create. And what we were doing with it was to try to differentiate experiences across a spectrum and have 5 different levels that were determined by these 4 criteria. One was the depth of immersion of the experience, so how deeply immersed are students being in the experience. And again, something like study abroad, it's very immersive. You're going to another country, another culture, trying to navigate just around a foreign city you've never been to is very complicated, as opposed to something like a guest speaker where you're staying in your seat, the experience is coming to you. The student autonomy, how much the students have to do on their own, how much guidance is there coming from a faculty member. If you're doing something that's sort of an in-class experience, where the student and the teacher are working together very hands-on, the student doesn't have to really figure out a ton by themselves, but again, that doesn't mean that no experience is being had. It just means that they're not being as autonomous as they would have to be necessarily in a real-world situation. Whereas if you get into some internships or some study abroad or some applied projects even, the students have to start figuring it out for themselves. The third criteria was about a requirement for preparation and foundational knowledge and skills. So if we take that tax internship example, you would hope that a student, by the time they've entered that internship, would have already learned about how to prepare taxes and how to do all that, and have gone through their fundamental accounting courses. They needed that preparation in order to be successful at any level inside of that internship. Whereas certain in-class experiences or guest speakers, there really isn't much of a need, or a very low level of need for preparation and foundational knowledge in order to engage with those experiences. And the last one was about potential for teachable error and failure. How likely is it, or how possible is it for students to make a mistake that has some consequences to it in the process of this experience? And so again, think about a guest speaker, there's not a whole lot of potential for teachable error or failure. Could they make a mistake? Could they ask a question that offends the speaker or something? Sure, but the likelihood is that things are going to go smoothly because it's a moderated experience in the context of a classroom. Whereas if we're studying abroad, you could get on the wrong train and end up in the wrong place. You could, in an internship, file a form the wrong way or interact with a client incorrectly that has some repercussions for the site and their supervisors, where there's a larger capacity for teachable error and failure. And so those 4 criteria are what inform our EBL taxonomy. And we always are very specific about noting with our faculty internally that as we start to differentiate the levels within the taxonomy, that this isn't a judgment of value on the experience itself. And so if we say that there's a level 1 activity as opposed to a level 3, 4, or 5, it's not saying that the activity is inferior. It just means in terms of those 4 criteria, it's at sort of a lower level, a lower pitch of those different things. And so we try to encourage all of our faculty, you want activities to be developed and experiences to be developed that are across all of our levels. So it's not about saying one is inferior to the other, that it has to be all 5 level activities or nothing, but there's value in all those experiences when we start thinking back to, again, the breadth and the depth of experiences and how they all have value. And so this is sort of a visualization of what our taxonomy would look like. We have 5 different levels. And again, as we move from left to right, levels 1 to level 5, the guiding criteria, again, are the depth of immersion, the student autonomy, the requirement for prep and foundational knowledge skills, and the potential for teachable error and failure. And those examples underneath each one of the levels are not necessarily set in stone, and there's some flexibility to them, but sort of trying to give you a general sense of what might fall into those buckets. So level 5, we're thinking about those very big things, the internships, the clinicals, the study abroad. Level 1, the very low things like guest speakers or group discussions in class, assuming that they follow an experiential model. And the middle is where we have guided field experience at level 2 against maybe level 4, where students are doing field experiences or field research on their own. Somewhere in the middle, we have simulations and labs. And so trying to differentiate that spectrum of experiences as opposed to saying, yes, it is, or no, it isn't, and kind of excluding the possibility for certain experiences to be considered as experiential. So what arguments did we start seeing emerge from this taxonomy once we laid it down? We started thinking about experiential learning being more about the what, why, and how rather than the where, when, and who. So for example, experiential learning we consider at RMU as it can occur within a classroom. And if you've talked among experiential educators, you know that that's a debatable topic. Some schools, some institutions, some people will say experiential learning absolutely cannot happen inside of a classroom. It has to be external with external environments, external clients, and that's not how we perceive it. If it is something that fulfills our DARA model, then we believe it can in fact be experiential. And so the emphasis is on what are we doing? How does it connect to the course learning outcomes? Why are we doing it? Why are we trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve in this experience? And less about the specific location, destination, and site, or when we're doing it, or who specifically we're doing it with. So that who piece kind of connects back to the simulation example. It's not necessarily 100% critical that we were doing a writing activity with an actual external client, but what are the skills? What's the process that we're trying to develop in that experience? So the emphasis is on the what, the why, and the how when we think about our taxonomy. A second point there is about trying to provide a framework for the field of experiential education where we're able to define experiences in shades of gray rather than black and white. That mentality of black and white being kind of like it's an internship is experiential, and if it's not an internship, it's not experiential, end of story. That is too exclusive, and it provides a lack of access and opportunity. So when we start framing this in shades of gray, we start opening things up more. The next point there, an argument emerging from the taxonomy, is the benefit of being able to scaffold these experiences to support student success. And so one example of that would be travel study. As I mentioned earlier, if we're thinking about students who've never been outside of their own neighborhood, asking them to take the leap suddenly to an international destination, it's a big one. So how can we scaffold these different levels of experiences across the taxonomy to maybe take them from their neighborhood to around their city, to around their country, and then get them to those level 5s where they're outside of the country, giving them that support, that comfort to build up to those higher levels of experiences. This can also create the taxonomy. The levels will create doorways for faculty buy-in and implementation. I did a year ago a webinar on creating faculty buy-in on experiential education. I think one of the ways in which institutions are struggling there is that if we have this all or nothing black and white perspective of experiential education, and we say the only way for a course or an experience to be considered experiential is for it to be a service learning project that requires 25 hours on the site, or a travel abroad project embedded inside of the course, then it's going to be more difficult to get more faculty into the process. Because if it's either do your classic examples of, kind of sage on the stage, it's either that, and now we're asking them to take this enormous leap to something very big that's overhauling the complete totality of their class, that's going to be a tough sell. Whereas if we can start to introduce faculty through the different levels of the taxonomy and say, you don't have to overhaul your whole class, but can you bring in some guest speakers? Can you introduce some simulations? Can you do some labs in the context of your class that can start to engage students in the learning that they're doing, and not simply be learning passively through lecture and other opportunities like that? The last thing there too is experiential education can be budget friendly for students and the institution. Like I mentioned, we were trying to build out all these initiatives at RMU on little to no budget. So if you have a kind of all or nothing perspective on experiential education, that can require some money. But if we start thinking about what are ways where you can simply just change some things around within a class to start getting students directly engaged in the experiences that they're learning about, that starts to be much more budget friendly. And you'll find that you can do a lot of things on little to no budget from that perspective. And so what are the applications of this taxonomy at other institutions, and how might you be able to apply this? One, again, is to get that increased student, faculty, and staff and administrative buy-in to experiential education. If you're asking people to take baby steps in the right direction of trying to get more opportunities into the courses, into your departments, that will be much easier for people to buy into rather than simply asking people to make a giant leap in one direction. So the baby step approach can be very beneficial in using a taxonomy approach. Opportunity to scale EE as well. And this isn't just about inside of the classroom, but can apply to all of our departments. So if you're working in a travel study department, thinking about developing experiences around your neighborhoods, around your city, if you're working in a career services department, thinking about some of those experiences you might already do, such as having like mock interview days. We can consider that experiential. If you provide mock interview opportunities for students and afterwards sit down with them and reflect on the experience and connect the dots for how they'll be able to actually do this when they get into a real interview, we consider that to be experiential. And so we can start to scale our experiential opportunities quite significantly if we start to think about things in those shades of gray. The third is to provide a framework to create an institutional definition of experiential education. That's something that, particularly in my role as an EEA faculty member, I find when I go speak to educators around the country is that not all institutions, even though they might be trying to increase their experiential education, not all institutions have a clear definition of what EE even is. What are the categories? What does it look like? What counts or doesn't count as an experiential opportunity? And so having these levels and layers in the taxonomy can help create an institutional definition that can provide a framework for both buy-in and scale. These different levels can also appeal to all student learning styles and trying to tap into that perspective inside of the classroom. And it can provide access to ease. So like I mentioned already, something like study abroad can be very cost prohibitive to be at the very least. And so as we layer out these things and scaffold the different experiences across levels, we can start to provide more access to more students. So what is next for our initiatives here at RMU, and what are we going to try to do? One is that we're starting to kind of plant the seeds for a mixed method study to further inform the items and levels of our taxonomy. So the visualization of the taxonomy I showed you earlier, those are the pockets of places and levels where generally our experiences will fall. So, guest speaker generally falls at level 1. Those are things that we're seeing internally, but we want to get more evidence, more support, more ideas to be able to inform what the levels look like and why. We also want to develop a rubric that can help us place items within the taxonomy levels so that there's more clarification about where things fall. We also want to continue to do more assessment of student learning outcomes at the different taxonomy levels to see if there is a clear difference in learning outcomes at a level 5 as opposed to a level 3 or a level 1, and see how transformative those experiences are. Again, right now we kind of assume, based on the evidence that's already out there and also the eyeball test that we can do internally, that those experiences at the higher levels are more transformative, but we really want some hard evidence to back that up. We also want to keep determining the connections between the taxonomy levels and programmatic curriculum mapping. Thinking about, might there be, to that idea of scaffolding, some evidence to support that in 100 level classes, we might want to do more level 1, level 2 experiences that can lead to level 3 and 4 at the 200 level and level 5 at the higher levels and graduate levels. So we want to figure out, do these experiences in this taxonomy leveling, does it help us kind of figure out how we might want to map out our curriculum to support the increase of both the levels and the access to experiences throughout a degree program. So before I open it up to questions, because we're just past 34 minutes, I want to make 2 quick mentions of things. One is that this summer, my university and Roosevelt University, in concert with us, will be hosting our 2nd annual EBL Institute conference in the heart of Chicago. We hosted our first annual last July, and it was really fun and really great. And our conference is all based around not only traditional conference opportunities like concurrent sessions. We also do a lot of excursions into the city where we can do hands-on learning, and it's really a lot of fun. So if you're interested in learning more about that or getting some more information on that, go ahead and visit robertmorris.edu/EBLI, and there's an opportunity for you to sign up for a mailing list where you'll get more info probably just in the next month or so, even as we start opening up our call for proposals and start announcing what some of those big experiential excursions will be. But we like to host this in the middle of the summer. We know that's not necessarily the easiest time for higher ed to come out to a conference, but we know that middle of July in Chicago, it is beautiful here and it's a lot of fun and there's many things to do. So that's why we wanted to plan it right in the heart of the summer. And if you have not heard yet, the 2020 annual NSEE conference will be in Salt Lake City, Utah next year in September, and the call for proposals is already open. So if you're interested in presenting at the next NSEE conference, go ahead and jump into that and go to nsee.org. So now I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box, and I will go ahead and answer any questions you may have. All right, our first question is, when labeling EL experience, did you grandfather any in, or did every experience course have to be vetted? That's a really great question. In the context of our certification process, everything had to be vetted. So we didn't grandfather anything in. Even our most kind of basic and fundamental experiences that we knew we've been doing for years, we requested that everybody send those experiences in through our certification process. And part of that came through the conversations that we were having internally, where we knew that a lot of what we were doing in our applied programs was experiential. And so, for example, in our health studies programs or culinary programs, the questions from faculty were, we know this stuff is hands-on and experiential. Do we really need to do anything more to prove it? And the answer was yes, absolutely, because while we know what you're doing might be hands-on, are you actually fulfilling the full model of what we're trying to achieve? Is there, in the process of this experience, an opportunity for reflection? And are you making a concerted effort to tie the learning outcomes of that experience to the transferable skills they'll use in the future? So we didn't grandfather anything in. We had to push everything through the entire certification process, which has been really beneficial to allow everyone to not only wrap their heads around the process, but also to, in some cases, rethink the experiences they were delivering to make better experiences in the end for students. Next question I have is, will this presentation be available on the NSEE website? And the answer is yes. The full webinar, a video of it, will be shared and will be posted on nsee.org, hopefully very, very soon. The next question is, do you ever monitor your experiences to make sure they are still experiential when used by someone else? That's a great question. And so that's sort of the next level of assessment that we're trying to figure out. How do we monitor that? The way in which we're sort of on secondhand monitoring that currently is through the course evaluations that the students are completing. And so they have an option in their course evaluations to mark down from a large list of experiences what were they exposed to throughout the duration of the course, and then what impact did it have on their student learning outcomes, and were there any experiences at all delivered. And so we have that currently, and we also have the tracking mechanism we have in place for faculty to report what experiences they're delivering in their classes. But we know currently that's one of the places where we have sort of a blind spot that we need to significantly enhance our assessment sort of processes and methods in order to really make sure that everything is staying up to par with what we expect it to be. Next question is, have you had discussions about how your taxonomy applies to students at different levels, freshmen to seniors? I'm thinking about student developmental levels and what kind of EBL they are ready for. Absolutely. That ties back a little bit to that idea of the curriculum mapping and thinking about, do the different levels have a different purpose at the different levels of degree programs? So might the freshmen be better off being exposed to levels 1 and level 2, or the seniors to levels 4 and level 5? And that kind of might fall in line as well with thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, about the introductory levels of courses being more at the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy. And so I think that's another piece that we're going to start digging into more deeply to figure out, is there really a direct connection there between the levels of the student and the levels of the taxonomy, or might there be some value in exposing students very early on to some of the higher level experiences, or might that be detrimental to them because they're not ready for it yet, as we think about like that example of scaffolding the travel study program. So yeah, that's a great question, and something that we're going to try to dig into more deeply as we move forward. The next question is, who's responsible for training new faculty on EBL? Currently, what we do is, since this is an institutional approach that we have, all new faculty as they come into Robert Morris University are introduced to these processes as part of our faculty onboarding. And so they're introduced pretty much from day one to, this is what we do and why we do it. And then from there, we have our Experience-Based Learning Institute, which is a group of faculty who are available throughout the entire academic year to be able to work with faculty directly on not only vetting the different experiences as they get submitted for our certification, but also working directly with faculty on building out experiences for their classes. So if a faculty member in any department comes in and says, I would like to do something for a nursing class, a culinary class, a business class, but I don't know what to do, we would be able to sit down with them and really build those experiences out. So we have a whole department that was built out for that purpose of training the new faculty and also providing continuous development for our current faculty as well. And that was a spot about 2 or 3 years ago, I guess it would have been fall of 2017 now, when we realized that our initiatives in experiential education that were initially being driven by our Center for Teaching and Learning had sort of grown beyond the capacity of that center, and it needed to be splintered off into its own thing. And so we created our EBL Institute to oversee all of that, including the faculty development and faculty onboarding piece. Very good questions. Are there any other questions? Our next question is, what infrastructure do you have for supporting EBL courses and programs? If a committee, are you finding that this committee is starting to advocate for experiential education at the institution and involved in more aspects of EL, not just EBL? Examples bringing up issues around liability and risk management, transportation issues, equity and access for levels of EBL, etc. Great question. So our infrastructure around supporting our EBL courses and programs, the course-based experiences are supported primarily through our EBL Institute. When we start looking at some of those experiences at the higher levels, such as study abroad or internship, we have an entire department that's around guiding internships for all of our programs institutionally, and we also have a centralized location for our travel study programs too. So we have a couple different departments that are overseeing all of this stuff collectively, but speaking to one another, and that's something that we're working on currently, is about making sure that those programs are, those departments are speaking even more clearly to one another, because they're all being guided by the same institutional model, our DARA model. So in terms of advocating for experiential education at the institution, that's sort of a, we have brought in, that was for several years, our overriding mission driven by our long-range plan at the institution was to make sure that sort of all of our faculty and staff are on board with this idea of experiential education and what it means. And so we've really had buy-in from across all levels of the institution, driven by our president, to make sure that people are on board with this. So the part about really needing to have advocacy for it hasn't been necessarily there, because the buy-in has been a little bit easier being a smaller institution and having this come down from the president. But in terms of driving some of those issues like liability and risk management, that's a place where bringing in NSEE's Experiential Education Academy to campus, which we did several years ago, is really beneficial to start. Even if we think that at some of our institutions we might have practitioners who are really educated on the subject matter, there's always some gaps and there's always some blind spots, and stuff like liability and risk management was a clear one that when we went through NSEE's legal issues EA workshop, that it was really beneficial for the whole group to start thinking about as we're developing these layers across the taxonomy of taking students on campus and off campus for experiences. What are some of the things that we need to be looking out for? Well, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, and I really appreciate everyone joining the webinar today. It's now currently 45 minutes past the hour, which is past our deadline for the webinar. So again, this will be posted on NSEE's website as soon as they're able to get it up there for everyone. So feel free to watch it again or view it again. And if you have any additional questions or comments for me, please feel free to reach out to me. There is my email address. It's pgaszak@robertmorris.edu. I'd be happy to have additional conversations with any of you or answer any questions. And I hope to see all of you at the EBL conference this summer or the NSE conference next September. So thank you again, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.